Welcome back to this edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, weekly radio news magazine, Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Starting to sound familiar? Find us online at tertiumquids.org. Our next guest has penned a great piece on the tax reform plan, and it actually takes us back further. It's titled A Bipartisan Tradition of Enabling Spendaholics, and she wrote it for Reason and Creators.com. You can find it in either place. She is an economic expert with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's Veronique de Rugy. Veronique, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Excellent. This is really something that has gone back so long. It's tough to track when we started to just allow people to spend money without any sort of vetting process on this. Was it the New Deal? Was it before that? Was it the Reconstruction? When did we discover that the American government could just spend taxpayers' money and by doing so influence even places the Constitution doesn't give them rights to go?
Well, it's been going on for a very long time. I think the ink wasn't dry on the Constitution, right, and even the Bill of Rights, that they were already fighting over which powers the government actually had. And so I think that tendency of people to want to expand the power of government, goes back a long way. In fact, James Madison warned us about it in the Federalist paper. So that's always the in this case the $20 trillion question. 'Cause that's the size of our current debt. It's like how do you tie the hands of all the interest groups and the politicians who serve them? And it's a question we don't have yet a good answer for.
Well, let me take it a step further, Veronique. You're the founder, the namesake of your university. George Mason stood up to James Madison and said, we're not going to support some centralized government. Their fear, along with Patrick Henry's at the time, was that centralized government was going to begin doing the exact things that we've wound up seeing it happen 240 years later.
I agree, but if I remember correctly, George Mason didn't sign the Constitution because he wanted a Bill of Rights included.
Yep.
But even that did not, end the fight over the expansion of government. And that's because, first, when politicians want to go around a rule, they find a way. And that piece that you cited by me at Creators, which was reprinted in Reason, talks about a modern instance of where government passed budget caps, spending caps to tie their hands and slow down the growth of government, and continues to spend beyond this cap by just suspending them. And if you've been following the debate over the tax tax bill that passed the Senate, because in the Senate there is an active rule that deficit and revenue should be offset by spending cuts.
Right.
It's a pay-as-you-go rule, right? This is a rule that has been implemented a while back and has never actually been used because each time senators go around it by suspending it. So it's a real problem because in this case, the arbitrator of the rules and the people who have an interest in violating the rules, they're all the same.
Well, is it fair, and I know that sometimes my learned economics friends will say it's not fair to compare the U.S. government to a family, but if a family finds itself, all of a sudden there's a car payment due and the mortgage is due, and it's let's just put it on the credit card. and we need to make the payments because you feel that responsibility to it. And the American government seems to be doing the same thing with this constant flirtation with continuing resolutions, where I believe if this budget passes, it's the first new budget since 2009 or 2010, Veronique. It's just been continuing resolutions on a budget that was passed 2 or 3 Congresses ago.
Yes. I think the family analogy is not an unfair one at all. I've used it many times just to describe the behavior, but the only conclusion that you can have is that it's a very dysfunctional family that's only made up of teenagers who don't earn any money
Yes.
and earn other people's money. And that's a real problem. The real problem with government when it comes to spending is that their incentives are extremely distorted because they're spending other people's money. Mm-hmm. There's very little connection between the mistakes that they make and the consequences that they feel and they suffer. And so it's extremely dysfunctional. And sometimes, I think about my own teenagers, and I'm kind of like, when they just want to go out for lunch with their friends all the time, but then also just refuse to babysit.
Right.
Because, kids, it's just not that fun to go babysit other people's kids, even though that's the only skill they really have out there.
Well, but that's where they earn money from.
I am thinking, I said, it's easy for you to say you don't want to do that particular job because I'm the one paying all the bills. And yes, this is a good analogy for the government. So it's not. I mean, and to be fair, also, the government has leeways that, especially the U.S. government has leeways that a regular family wouldn't have. It would be like having, an uncle who is actually the banker deciding of your loans.
Yeah.
Because the U.S. is so big and it does have, there is such a thing as the U.S. government has a fairly good reputation. Then, bankers are willing to lend in a way that probably the bankers would never lend my teenage daughters.
Well, hopefully she's your teenage daughter. She's got something on the ball there, Veronique. Veronique de Rugy from the Mercatus Center is talking with her article, and we'll put it up on all of our social media, Bipartisan Tradition of Enabling Spendaholics. I've often compared it, the scenario you were just describing is like you talk to, I think the phrase is the idiot sons of the idiot sons, but I refer to it as trust fund grandchildren, where you're a wealthy person, but you have no direct connection to how that wealth was generated. Maybe your grandfather started a business and it became successful, and your father stewarded it and it's still successful, and now you've got all this money, but you have no real understanding of where all that money came from, and you're just out there thinking, oh, this is great, I'm going to buy a Ferrari and a Lamborghini and I got all this money and I don't know where it came from. You don't know the work that was put into it.
And I'm going to trash people who work really hard because they're boring.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the reasons we expend considerable sound and fury on this, Veronique, is in my mind, and what are your thoughts on this? I don't know if we've ever talked about this. In my mind, I've looked in the history of humankind, and every time any sort of democracy collapses, it collapses economically, and dictatorships rise up in its wake, sometimes using the same symbols of the democracy, but Greece, Rome, the history of mankind is full of places where democracies discover that, if I vote for the right person, I make more money, so I'll start voting for that right person, and eventually the economy collapses and a dictatorship rises up, and I don't want my grandchildren to face that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to tell whether our democracy is at stake, but I can see that there's a real tension, and that if the group of people who are living at the expense of others grow beyond a certain point, then there's going to be real issues. I think we're far from that moment where we're going to disrespect the concept of democracy, but who knows? Maybe you're right. I do think, though, that the biggest risk that we face is that not addressing our economic issues, and in particular our growing, incredibly fast-growing debt. And we're in not so long, in 2030, we'll have $30 trillion of debt
Man,
under our belts. It's
that's-
like, I mean, it's just a huge number, and there's no relief in sight unless we address our entitlement problems.
Yeah.
And the real consequences of this is one that's not pleasant either, because it's a permanently slow growth, meaning basically destroying wealth, slow growth economy with high unemployment. Just look at Europe. And I just don't understand that there are still people, like the big narrative right now on the left is like when the liberals are back in power, when the Democrats are back in power, they're going to repeal the tax cuts, and they're going to put more money into Social Security and Medicare, making the problem that we face even worse. And I'm always wondering, how can they not look at the numbers and see what I see?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you said that the demographics are changing.
Yes,
but and it's one thing to say if we're $20 million or $20 trillion in debt, and we were helping all these people, and there were people were, but all this debt hasn't helped a soul except for perhaps the people who head up the bureaucracies that administer them, whether it's the VA or Social Security, Medicaid. Every one of these is just riddled with problems. So we're bankrupting ourselves to do a bad job, it seems, Veronique.
Well, it's. I'll just offer one caveat. I agree with your overall statement, but I think by some accounts, some of these programs have helped lower income Americans. I mean, there's no denying it. But the problem is at what cost to the overall to everyone else. But even for those people who are now, we've expanded the number of people who receive a large amount of support from the government, and that has consequences for them too, even as they enjoy, like seeing some of their income and standard of living go up. So the overall trend that you described, I think, is entirely correct. And this is the worst part, and this is why it's so hard for us. It's like there's also not denying that for some people, there's one aspect of this redistribution that goes on that is extremely positive in their lives, but they can't see the cost or the cost associated to them and to others for the system that they think basically they see the benefits and none of the cost. And as such, they ask for an extension of this, and it's just not working.
Veronique, we've seen surveys done that say demographically and statistically younger people are in greater and greater numbers saying, we think socialism is a much better idea. And if that's the case, first of all, I don't think they realize what socialism winds up looking like. First, it collapses like Venezuela, then it becomes like North Korea. Maybe we don't teach that well enough in school, but that's a concerning matter as well, because we hear people saying, capitalism is broken. I would argue it's been decades since we've actually had a capitalist economy in this country.
Yes, and I think that the fear, the millennials, for instance, who are claiming in larger number that they think socialism is great, is like your trust fund, a kid, like twice or three times removed from when the wealth was created. It's like they have no understanding of what socialism really is. But I think that when you actually dig into these polls, you actually see that when they say they like socialism, they don't like actual socialism, right? They don't. They like the idea of helping needy Americans, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. And there's also the fact that the reality will kick in when they start working, because when you ask them. It's an interesting, actually, demographic. When you ask them about helping people, they say yes, more of that, more government services. But then they have a very, very positive vision of businesses and profit, because they understand. I mean, they're the pickiest and most high maintenance consumers that the U.S. has ever seen, and they totally understand that what profit is a reward to producers who serve their customers well. But they see the market economy as much more efficient than the government. So I think we have to be very careful to be completely freaked out about millennials because they're not straightforward,
Right.
socialist lover. And again, remember the fact that they're such demanding consumers means that they're not going to want to stand in line to get government health care. And they also know they're better served by calling an Uber late at night than by waiting for the cartel taxi companies.
Right.
And so I think we have to not completely freak out about them.
Well, and we should be encouraging that thought process because the more we fertilize that, the harder, the deeper the roots are going to go. So let's circle back to Congress and in finishing up here, Veronique. I mean, they passed the Budget Control Act in 6-7 years ago, and they ignore that. What can we do to stop them from breaking the bank?
Shaming them. I mean, that's what, we need to call on them to be fiscally responsible. I'm hoping it's never easier to be fiscally responsible and to agree to get to fiscal conservative budget rules than when the economy is growing. So let's hope that this tax cut passes and that the reduction to the corporate income tax in particular brings a lot of economic growth to this country. It will be good, for many reasons, but one of them definitely is that we can hope that this will basically change their mind about trying to address Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. It's easier in a growing economy than it is when the economy is slow.
Oh, absolutely. I still worry, though, some of the rhetoric is, when we do these tax cuts, we're going to get more revenue in government. I'm like, no, we don't want to worry about getting more revenue in government. We want more revenue in the citizens' pockets. That's what we want, so that they go out and do all the things that a prosperous society does. And there have been hopeful signs of that, Veronique. Factories opening in Dearborn, Michigan, of all places. And so it seems like there's a hopeful wind on the blow there. And I appreciate your time. Again, it is creator.com is the website. You can go there, find out more at the Mercatus Center, mercatus.org as well. Creators.com, I'm sorry. Veronique de Rugy, thank you so much for your insight this morning on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Have a great weekend and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you, too, and thank you for having me.